Welcome to Lecture 2B on Intercultural Communication and Diversity and Inclusion. This is Professor Herman with Business 1950, Business Communication. So in this presentation, I'm just going to cover two topics, intercultural communication, and then we're going to talk in a little bit more depth about diversity and inclusion. In the middle of that discussion, I'm going to pause the lecture and split it into two parts, because in the middle there's a very helpful video I'd like you all to watch. First, when we talk about intercultural communication, this is often what we picture. And events like this are fantastic. This is the Intercultural Festival at Central European University in 2018. That's a school that has a presence in both Budapest and Vienna. Really lovely, interesting school that's doing lots of cool work. I actually went to a 2-week seminar there early in grad school and really enjoyed the experience. Now, on Canvas, I've posted an additional reading that will help you understand intercultural communication in the workplace, which is obviously a little bit more complicated than simply going to an intercultural festival and having people explain to you in specific detail what their culture is about, their foods, their languages, etc. And so on Canvas, I've posted a reading that helps you get a sense of what the variables are that you want to understand and really grapple with before you try to engage in intercultural communication. It's by a gentleman named Geert Hofstede, and the title of the article is Cultural Dimensions in Management and Planning. It's a great article, even though it's all the way back from 1984. It's still really the benchmark in terms of the fundamentals of a lot of the things that you're looking for in intercultural communication. And Hofstede identifies 4 different variables and then provides a table that tells you where different countries fall on the spectrum for each of these variables. Again, the article is from 1984, and so there have been some changes, some subtle, some substantial, in various countries along these different variables since then. But it at least will give you a sense of what it is that you're looking for when you go to study another culture, especially if you're going to go abroad to try to conduct some business. So one of those variables is individualism versus collectivism. I really like this photo of a bunch of people reaching into a large dish of Indian dal. Obviously, this is from a society where people are pretty comfortable getting up close and personal with each other. This is a more collectivist kind of set of norms. You'll be unsurprised to hear that the U.S. is an exceptionally individualistic culture. We don't rely very heavily on our groups or clans. Or families. We look very closely at our own individual households and how they're doing, such that siblings or let alone cousins and even parents and children from the same family can be doing very differently, and we as a society are very comfortable with that. More collectivist cultures obviously put more emphasis on bringing the whole family along together, bringing the whole even neighborhood or community or group along at roughly the same pace. This is another one that's super interesting, which is large versus small power distance, which is to say how comfortable are we in any given cultural setting with there being a large difference between those who have a lot of power and those who have very little power, and very small power distance. And if you want a really good measure of how people fall on the scale in a given culture, look at the titles that they use. So American culture has a very small power distance, and this is evidenced by the fact that many of you are comfortable emailing me and saying, "Hi, Bill." And that's because the difference in power between a professor and a student is one that we in America, myself included, want to minimize. We're not comfortable with a very big distance in power between authorities and those they oversee. Now, there are exceptions, even in American culture, the military being a really good example of that. You would not, if you're a private, you would not address a sergeant as "Hey, Sarah." That would go very poorly for you. And, those of you who are in the military know better than that. So I would recommend that you think of that as a way to encapsulate the difference between a large and a small power distance. It can even exist within different cultural contexts within the same broader culture. But other countries, such as Germany, are much more formal. Japan even more so, such that there's a very, very high comfort and even an expectation that those with more power will be treated with a lot of deference, will be addressed by their title, etc., etc. Another variable that Hofstede finds, which I think is just fascinating as well, is strong versus weak uncertainty avoidance. In other words, how comfortable is a society with chance? We in the United States, at least in the mainstream, sort of dominant American culture, tend to be pretty comfortable with chance. That's why we have a pretty thin social safety net here. Other countries are much less comfortable with chance and want to build a much more routinized and formalized way of making sure that the difference between those who are very fortunate and very unfortunate, just based on chance alone, is minimized. And so that's another variable on which you should assess where you before you go to deal with folks who are from a different culture, because this difference can trip people up. I urge you to read Hofstede's article, in particular on this one, because there's a lot more to it here, and I'm not going to be able to have the time to really elaborate, but it's super interesting. And the final is masculinity versus femininity, and this is a bit of I want to say a metaphor, but it's not quite a metaphor. It's a connection. It's a set of connections of ideas that doesn't literally relate to how much testosterone one has, for instance. But the some of the variables that he talks about are competitiveness versus solidarity, equity versus equality, sympathy for the strong or for the weak, achievement motivation versus relationship motivation, concepts of the quality of work life, career expectations, acceptability of macho manager behavior, and sex roles in the workplace. And this isn't exactly a perfect fit of masculinity versus femininity, but I think it's a pretty good metaphor to summarize most of this. And that's the idea of the super yacht, right? Are we comfortable in a society where just some people have tremendous amounts of money because they've won their financial competitions in the marketplace? The where the idea, well, that's equitable because this person worked really hard and created a new idea that is really popular, so we're comfortable with them having a yacht such as this. Which, by the way, this is the iNova yacht. It's 160 feet long. Yours for the low price of just 20 million euros, about $23 million. Anyway, so are we comfortable with a society that's organized that way? If so, that's a pretty, what Hofstede calls a pretty masculine way of looking at the world versus a more feminine way of looking at the world, which is making sure that everyone simply gets fed, and that everyone has enough, versus making sure that the winners get everything. Now, the book talks about multiculturalism and ethnocentrism, and I think these are really important terms. I just wanted to highlight them really quickly. Multiculturalism is appreciating diversity among people, including diversity between and within countries. And ethnocentrism is the belief that an individual's own cultural group is superior. Now, most of us are going to look at this and say, well, if it's one of those two things, I'm more multicultural, or at least I try to be. At least I think that's how most people would look at this delineation, and I think that's a fine and perfectly acceptable goal, and I hope that you identify that way. But it's not so simple as we often represent this. We do often oversimplify this, right? We usually think it's something like a light switch. Like, oh, well, I didn't really understand their culture, so I read some stuff about it, and now I understand it. Boom, I flipped that switch on, and now I appreciate their culture on its own terms. But really, it's not so simple. It's more like the slow process of becoming flexible or strong, or building endurance through physical exercise. You can't just strap on a pair of running shoes, no matter how fancy the running shoes are, and go run a marathon if you've not been running. That's not going to go well for you. You're going to blow out a hamstring. You're gonna not finish the marathon probably. So if you want to, do, really elaborate yoga poses, you gotta start with the basic yoga poses. And multiculturalism is very much like that. You have to have patience. You have to have practice. And so the best way to become multicultural is to expose yourself to as many cultures as possible and to try to understand them on their own terms. Now that doesn't mean you have to adopt the tenets of that culture as your own. That doesn't mean you have to endorse any of them. but to understand them on their own terms and to be able to make sense of what it is like to live within those cultural expectations and how that's different than one's own. That is the strength and flexibility exercise that is required to really become more culturally nimble. So that's enough about multiculturalism. I want to talk a little bit more now about how that usually plays out in a domestic context, which is in the idea of diversity and inclusion. Now, I've put up a book here called "The Inclusion Dividend" by Mark Kaplan and Mason Donovan, and I really like the subtitle, which is "Why Investing in Diversity and Inclusion Pays Off." And I think that's a really important lesson, and it's a great way to think about how we should be talking about diversity and inclusion communication, the way that we talk about it. Because the more we talk about it like this, the more it becomes true within your organization, within your division, within your company, and therefore the better off your division or company is, and also the better off everyone in your workplace really can be as well. But it's going to take a bit of reframing. I want to reframe this discussion from doing good to doing well. Right. The individual and ethical frame is what we might call the traditional frame for diversity and inclusion, and that's the doing good frame. I'm going to start there and explicate that a little bit because that's important, and we do have to start there, and we do have to have a solid foundation there. It starts with the idea of simply diversity, that we just get diverse people in the room, we get diverse people under the roof in the company, at the school, and then that's our primary goal, is having a diverse crowd around. And when we're there, we all have to fight individual bias. Obviously, this includes not being openly hostile or espousing hostile attitudes, but it also includes making sure that we're not bringing implicit bias to grading decisions as a professor, to HR and promotion decisions as an employer, to team delegation decisions within your team. That we don't look at someone and see merely a demographic a category, but that we see the person for the work that they're truly capable of. And I think this is truly the American ideal for virtually all Americans, is that we do at least acknowledge the need to try to fight our individual bias. I don't think this is very controversial here. Obviously, some of us are better at it than others, but I don't think this as an ideology is especially controversial. We've all been taught this since civics classes all the way back in elementary school. And the idea is largely to push the individual to do right and to catch ourselves right. So, oh, I almost said something that was thoughtless or insensitive, so I'll do better next time. Or I didn't realize that I was bringing a bias about X, Y, Z into my hiring decisions or my grading decisions, and so I need to try to catch myself and make sure I'm not doing that. And we're all doing this so that we can do the right thing because it's ethical, because it's moral. Now, I'm not arguing against any of this stuff. In fact, I think there's a great example of this that I think I would encourage you all to watch this series. I think it's super interesting and pretty helpful, and I found it pretty educational, actually. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And I'm going to pause my lecture here and underneath, so I'm going to break this lecture up. And if you go back to the Canvas, you'll find that just underneath it, I've got a link here to the YouTube so that you can watch this episode of Uncomfortable Conversations with the Black Man. Spoiler alert, it's the one with Matthew McConaughey. And so go ahead and go watch that, and then come back and watch the second part of the lecture after that.